Well, it's good to see everybody tonight, and we're happy to welcome Dr. Joy O'Keefe and learn more about bats. And I hope we'll all learn about the importance of bats in a healthy ecosystem. Dr. O'Keefe is an assistant professor and wildlife extension specialist in natural resources and environmental sciences at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She's been studying bats for 23 years, and presently her research program is working on solutions to conservation challenges facing bat populations. She'll be sharing with us steps we can take to provide habitat in our own yards or neighborhoods, and we'll learn ways to help protect bat populations and also hear about international efforts to count and monitor bats across North America. And finally, we'll go out to find some bats in White Oak Park. So as she finishes, we want to get right out of here because we're timing it with sunset. And according to Dr. O'Keefe, the bats come out about 10 minutes after sunset. So as you leave the church parking lot, you want to follow Cottage Avenue down. When you see the Dollar General and Martin Luther King Drive goes over to the right, you want to go left and stay on Cottage and go to the main parking lot there at White Oak Park. If you want to go with other people, carpool down there, that's fine, or take your own car. It's a pretty sizable parking lot, so I don't think there'll be a problem. But we just want to encourage you when we finish to get out there. And she is open to answering questions as we go out there. So we aren't going to do a long question answer at the end of her presentation right now. We'll wait till we get out there in the wild. So welcome, Dr. O'Keefe. We're anxious to learn about bats.
All right. Thank you very much. All right. I have limited time, so I'm going to try to get started and stay on track. So enjoy our eastern red bat talking to us while we're holding it in the hand. So first off, I want to just talk to you about why you should care about bats. It's delightful to see so many people who do care about bats, who come out and want to see and learn more about bats. There's a number of reasons why that a lot of people might not think of. One I think is kind of cool is that bats are remarkably diverse. So bats are actually second to rodents in terms of diversity when we look at mammals. So bats are mammals just like us, and rodents have more species, but bats are arguably way cooler because they're really cool facial features, they're really cool habits, the things they eat, where they spend their time during the day, their roosts. Is really diverse. So this is, of course, a vampire bat. We have 3 species of vampire bats, none in Illinois, sadly. They're only in Central and South America and down Mexico down to South America. But vampire bats are just an example of the incredible diversity in bats. I mean, to have evolved the ability to just subsist only on blood is pretty incredible. So there's actually 1,482 species of bats now. The number keeps changing all the time. I go to batnames.org, as I did today, to update the number in my slideshow. We have seen an explosion of bats in terms of adding new species as biologists are working, evolutionary biologists and molecular biologists are working on separating species that look very similar, but that are actually quite different. So some hot spots for biodiversity include the northern part of South America, where you could find 100 different bat species in the same site on the same night. And then also in parts of Africa, like in Kenya, there's incredible diversity. And so people are untangling those. And as we do that, we start to see more and more species added to the list. Most of our bats are insectivores, meaning they eat insects, or really arthropods, we should say, because they don't just eat insects. We've actually found in some of our diet work that bats eat a lot of spiders. They also eat scorpions. A lot of bats in the tropics are frugivores, meaning they eat fruit. And there are actually fruits that are specialized to be eaten by bats. Why would a fruit want to be eaten by a bat? Well, because bats are prolific poopers. And so they will drop those seeds, and they're actually really important in rainforest regeneration. We also have nectarivores that are adapted to consuming nectar from plants. And of course, those are important pollinators. So my friend Nathan Muchala, who's a professor in Missouri, documented when he was a PhD student, this is just a remarkable paper, he documented this bat, a Neurofistulata, that has the longest tongue of any mammal. If we had the same size tongue, our tongue would be 10 feet long. And the tongue rolls up and stores in the chest of the bat. And then there's a specific flower that it is adapted to drink from, that is able to get the nectar from. And of course, this bat is an important pollinator for that flower. Then some bats are piscivores, eating fish. And that adaptation has evolved many times in bats. So we find bats in different parts of the world that have particularly big feet, good for trawling along the surface of the water and grasping fish. We do have a few species that are carnivores, and sometimes it happens like surprisingly. Bats that normally eat insects happen to really like to eat migratory birds too, as they're flying by. But then there are bats that are specialists, and there's some bats that eat frogs that are even adapted to hearing the calls that frogs are making and figuring out where exactly that frog is. And then there are also bats that eat other bats. So we have a bat called the false vampire, Vampirum spectrum, which is actually a pretty big bat, and they will eat other bats. So whereas vampire bats don't eat other bats, the false vampire does. And then we have our sanguivores, and that's the vampire bats. There's 3 species. In the Midwest, we're not as diverse as in the neotropics. We only have 13 species and 2 that occasionally show up. I should say there's actually 14 in far, far southwest Missouri, if you want to count that as the Midwest. There's an Ozark big-eared bat that makes 14. But these 13 species are found throughout various parts of the Midwest, and all of them are found in Illinois. So we actually have great diversity here in Illinois, driven by the Mississippi River, Ohio River Valley. That really kind of ramps up our biodiversity for bats and for a lot of other species as well. Because we get some southern species that occur there in the cypress swamps along the river. And then we have a lot of rocky karst habitat in southern Illinois, which is attractive to many of our bats. Some of them are migrating through Illinois right now on their way back to who knows where, because we really don't know a lot about where bats go when they migrate. They're incredibly difficult to study. Our largest bat, the hoary bat, which is this guy right here, this is the largest bat in most of North America. Its wingspan's about 15 inches, and it weighs about 30 grams as an adult. If it's a pregnant female, maybe, which isn't that much. 30 grams is 30 paper clips. We are just now starting to be able to put GPS tags on that bat, but slight catch. You have to recapture the bat to get the GPS tag off to get the information to figure out where it went. That's kind of challenging. So we don't know their migratory paths the way we do for a lot of birds. So we still have so much to learn about bats. As I mentioned, most bats are insectivores. They have a really simple diet of arthropods, and they're really important to us for that reason. So bats they're not super discriminate. We think they mostly eat based on size and availability and what's in the habitats that they're adapted to forage in. But studying 2 species of bats that were at one point fairly common here in the Midwest, the Indiana bat and the northern long-eared bat, we found that their diet is primarily composed of crane flies, which are like the big bumbling relatives of mosquitoes. And then mosquitoes were second on the list. Midge flies or biting flies, small flies. So these are all things that bite us. Well, not crane flies. Crane flies don't bite anybody, but mosquitoes and midge flies bite. So it's good. Bats are eating pests of humans, right? And then they're also eating microlepidopterans, which are small moths, tiny moths. And bats do eat larger moths. Larger bats eat larger moths. And then they're also eating leafhoppers. So leafhoppers and moths are important pests of plants, right? And sometimes that can be a good relationship, but sometimes it can be detrimental. The bats are known to be important predators of the cotton bollworm and the corn earworm moth, the same kind of insect that's moving and eating on different kinds of crops as it moves north. They'll also eat spotted cucumber beetle, which is an important pest on not only corn, but also melons. So we know that they eat our pests of crops, and it's quite likely that they're really vital to pest control in crops that are grown at smaller scales. So I don't have time to go in today to giving you the details, but when you look at the vast open corn and soy fields that we have here in the Midwest, it's not likely that bats are equally active across those fields because some of them you're going quite a ways from a tree line. And we find that bat activity kind of tails off as you go out into those fields. But in smaller crop systems like vineyards, nuts, orchards, rice, those are places where bats can be really important. And there's a number of studies that are finding that. Some important things to know about bats that I think everybody should know about bats. Bats are not flying mice. So we've already separated them from rodents. So you know that. The Germans named them Die Fledermaus, but they are not flying mice. And they have quite a few differences, but the main one is the way that they live. They have very slow lives. And I don't know if you noticed, but both of the bats here and here have a band, a little bracelet on their arm. And that's one way that we can tell how old bats are. So by putting a little bracelet with a unique ID on there, we can actually, if we recapture the bat, figure out where was it caught and when. And this tiny bat, which weighs about 4.5 grams, this is a male eastern small-footed bat, was recaptured 9 years after it was first banded. So I want you to take a guess at how long a tiny bat like this 4.5 gram bat could possibly live. Anybody have a guess? 20 years. What have you got? 30. Any other guesses? Nobody wants to contest you. Okay, well, let's see what the records are. Whoops. So in North America, the longevity record for bats is actually 32 years, but this paper here shows that we see 18 to 25 and a half years. I don't know how they got 0.6 actually, but this is for the little brown bat, which is a close relative of the small-footed bat I just showed you. In Russia, another bat in the same genus, Myotis, which is the mouse-eared bats, which they are all over the world, was documented at 41 years of age. That's really incredible, right? So how do they achieve that? How do they achieve such a long lifespan? Well, the bats that live the longest are the bats that hibernate during the winter. So if you think about it, they're spending a large portion of the year inactive, which for a long time has been a really good strategy for bats. There's very little to worry about when you're hibernating in a cave or a mine or some underground space during the winter. And you can just get through the winter without needing to eat, without being necessarily exposed to predators. But with a lot of changes in the environment, not only global climate change, where we're seeing warming temperatures, but also the introduction of pathogens like fungi, and then also more predators coming into these spaces, like raccoons that have gotten to have pretty abundant populations. We do see bats at risk while they're hibernating. But even this paper on the top shows that exceptional longevity still occurs despite this devastating disease, white nose syndrome, that is killing bats while they're hibernating. So it's a good strategy to hibernate. Another thing that's interesting about bats is that they're slow to reproduce. So this is another aspect that makes them really different from rodents. So when you think of a rodent, you probably think of a large litter of young. Bats that live long lives typically only give birth to one pup per year. And then they will breed for, we don't know exactly how many years, but let's say they have 20 or 30 years, So a litter of mice could be 12 or 15 or even 20, and then they might have multiple litters a year, but they live incredibly short lives that are really risky. And bats are living more conservative, slow lives. So bats are also incredibly faithful to their homes. And so that's something that worked well for them in the past. But again, with a lot of change in the environment, that can be kind of tricky. But we document that, again, by putting bands on bats' wings. So here's an Indiana bat with a little band on his wing. We put that band on the bat here at this site in central Indiana, just southwest of Indianapolis. And then bats that we banded there were tracked to these 5 caves. in south central and then far southern Indiana. So we're able to make the connections for those bats between their summer and their winter sites. And what's interesting is that they come back to the same site every summer, and they go to the same site generally every winter. And people even see bats in the same place on the wall of a cave that they saw them a couple years earlier when they were in there. So they're very faithful. So if you see a bat circling around your backyard, it could very well be the same bat. Now, most bats, this is important for what we're going to do tonight, find their food and navigate using echolocation. This is high frequency sound above the range of human hearing, usually. There are a few bats, like the hoary bat, that will sometimes call within the range that we can hear, but usually it sounds above 20 kilohertz. They use these high frequency sounds because that is good for echolocating on tiny insects, because the wavelengths are short enough that they can get good information back from the echo that bounces off of those prey. Not all bats echolocate, but most of the bats around the world do, and all of the bats here in Illinois do. We can, to some degree, differentiate their sounds, and we use fancy devices like this one or this one to listen to them. So I'm going to let you guys hold on to some of these tonight, and when we turn it on, you'll see that the lowest number is 15. We're going to tune it up to about 30 kilohertz. So this is now above the range of human hearing. So you can't hear my fingers, but you can when I put them in front of this detector, right? And so this is what's going to allow us to hear these bat sounds. And I know you're going to have this question, because everybody always does when we do a bat walk. How do I know when I've heard a bat? And all I can tell you is you'll just know. So it does make a very staccato kind of sound, and they're usually pretty loud. When they're close to you, they're louder, so it'll be louder. And this button on the side is the volume, so you can turn that up and down. And then you can tune this dial to somewhere around 30, 35 kilohertz. This bat detector picks up sounds that sweep through that frequency. And I will have the more fancy one if it's cooperating. It gives me a picture of the call on the screen, and I will tell you what frequency to listen to. So I might say, turn it to 30 or turn it to 35. You'll hear this bat. I did a bat walk a few weeks ago in Greenville, Illinois, and we had bats going from 30 up to 45. So we were kind of tuning our dial as we got different species. So human hearing stops around 20 kilohertz, although as you get older, you may even lose, a little bit. So some people can hear just a little bit below 20 when they're younger, and then as they get older, they start to lose it. So I used to be able to hear hoary bats. I don't know if I still can. I haven't heard a hoary bat in years, but I haven't been around where they were flying. So we'll take that bat detector and get those echolocation calls. And Kathy mentioned I'd tell you about our program to monitor bats. So we actually have sent out bat detectors to volunteers in 8 Midwestern states. My lab is part of a program called the North American Bat Monitoring Program. And we run the Midwest Bat Hub, which is one of the hubs that collects data for this national program. And there's a lot of different kinds of data that we could collect, but the primary one that we work with is acoustic data. So we send out detectors with really good microphones like this, but that are set up with kind of a rugged case that's waterproof. People put them up on the side of a tree or on a post, and then they record bats, and the microphones are waterproof so they can sit out in the environment for a long time. We get gobs of data that looks like this, which is these waveforms of the bat sounds, and then we process them through Bat ID software, which is I'd say about 85% accurate. The software will tell you it's more accurate, and then we get the IDs, and we can tell you, in an area which species are present. So this is an example of one site where we had, 3 species dominating, but there were other species present as well. And our volunteers give us those data. We upload them to the national partner portal, and then people are doing this kind of stuff all over the country and all over the continent. And from that, we can get information on the status and distribution of bats. So here's a little bit of data from Illinois. Interestingly, for 2 different species. So this is the Indiana bat, which is a federally endangered species. This is the little brown bat. And what I want you to focus in on is where the red blobs are. Those are the areas with the highest activity. And what interests me about this is that they're a little bit different. So little browns, which are more common as you move further north and really common in Canada and up in, say, Minnesota, Wisconsin, they're more common and more active in the Chicago suburbs. And then as we move west towards the Mississippi River, whereas Indiana bats seem to be most common here, kind of centered around the Illinois River and to the west. And importantly, there's a massive mine here in Hannibal, Missouri, just across the river from Quincy, that has over 200,000 Indiana bats hibernating in it during the winter. So it's not surprising to me that if you just go east from that mine, that you start to get a lot of Indiana bat activity. So that's the kind of data that we can get on distributions. What is important to these bats? Where are they found? By using acoustics. Even with all of its inaccuracies, it's not 100% confident, but we still get good information that we can use to make decisions about how to manage for bats. Why is that important? Well, many bat species are in peril due to disease and habitat loss and other threats. As I mentioned, there's some issues associated with human development and climate change that have been problematic for bats. Two I want to focus in on is white nose syndrome and wind turbines. So white nose syndrome, has anybody heard of white nose syndrome? A few people. Okay, so this is a fungus that actually we think was brought to the US sometime in the early 2000s, discovered in 06, 07 during the winter in New York in a cave that was a show cave that people could walk into. And so we think maybe somebody brought it on their boots. It got introduced to this cave. It started growing on the bats. And the first pictures of the bats had this white fungus growing on their noses. And so it was called white nose syndrome. But it's actually more problematic for their wings. It's necrotic on the wing tissue. And then the bat's immune system kind of kicks into overdrive when it realizes it's being attacked. And they actually do a little bit of damage to their own wings just through the cellular degradation. So they end up with holes in their wings. They're really disturbed while they should be hibernating in the nice, cozy wintertime when they didn't have anything to worry about. Now there's this novel fungus that wasn't there before. And it's been really problematic for our cave hibernating bats. We've lost millions of bats. However, it's great to say that I've been around long enough that this came on the scene when I was a PhD student in 2006. And now we're starting to see some bats recover. And actually, even some bats are just doing fine in spite of it. So those 215,000 Indiana bats in this mine over in Hannibal, Missouri, seem to be doing well despite white nose syndrome. And some sites are better for them than others. We've been surveying bats in these small mines in southern Illinois that are silica mines, where the walls are almost entirely white. And that silica doesn't seem to be very hospitable to the fungus. And so it's not a great site for it to grow. And so bats seem to be doing pretty well in those sites. So that's good news. The other big issue is wind turbines. And this is problematic for our long distance migrants, the ones I said we don't know where they go. Well, we do know the pathways they're flying through to some degree because we find them in large numbers at the base of these wind turbines. They're flying through the same areas that are good for collecting wind, for energy, are apparently good for migratory corridors for bats and birds. And so when we survey those sites, we do find these migratory bats having impacted the turbines, hit the turbines, and usually are not making it through that. So this is a concern. It's had a lot of attention put on it. There's a lot of innovation going into trying to stop deaths of bats at wind turbines and for white nose syndrome as well. For wind turbines, the solution seems to be to, at least to cut down on the deaths, is to turn the turbines off during periods of low wind when we know bats are migrating. Because we're not sacrificing that much energy gain, but we are actually able to save the lives of some bats. So that's the kind of work that's being done. I just want to point out where we're at with the status of bats in Illinois at large. So all of these species are impacted by white nose syndrome to some degree and are endangered or on the way to being endangered. The gray bat actually is doing pretty well, but we have pretty small populations of them in Illinois. And the Indiana bat, as I mentioned, we have a very large population over in Hannibal. These three have declined a lot from white nose syndrome, but we still catch them here in Illinois. These two species are at risk from wind energy. Hopefully we'll hear a red bat tonight. This is still one of our more common bats to get in urban areas, second most common behind the big brown bat, which is the one that if we're going to hear a bat, it'll be a big brown bat. So if you've ever had a bat in your house, it was a big brown bat. Somebody told me, I was at a wedding this weekend in Georgia, and somebody came up to me and they said, I had a bat, it's roosting on my front porch. And I said, it's a big brown bat. And then they showed me the picture on their phone, and it was a big brown bat because that's the bat, right? So it's very common. It's been a great generalist who's able to adapt to human structures and just move into whatever we build and says, okay, I'll take this. This is fine. The evening bat is also a very common bat here in the Midwest and actually seems to be moving north as the climate warms. So that's kind of interesting. Globally, bats face a lot of threats. We've got a lot of this under control because we have an understanding of, what bats need, although I will say we have intensive agriculture, but we still tend to maintain high bat populations, and we do have more regulations on pesticides and herbicides than in other places in the world. So that's helpful. But still our most pressing threats for bats in the United States are habitat loss, wind energy, and then this white nose syndrome fungus. So what can you do to help bats? Well, take the knowledge that you learn here today and educate other people. I don't know if you've noticed, but sometimes people don't really like bats. I can't imagine why. So I try to spread bat love wherever I go and, get people to think positively about bats. And it's not that hard to do once you start telling them some of the cool things that bats do and how awesome they are and interesting. Protect and enhance natural areas. I think you guys already think about this all the time. So kudos to you. You're already saving bats. And think about bats year round, especially in light of climate change. It's very possible that bats are on our landscape during the winter. And the more we can do to minimize disturbance, like reducing the numbers of lights that are on outside and reducing your use of pesticides so that there can be more insects for bats to eat. Conserving energy so we don't have to rely so much on wind energy and other forms of energy production that might also be detrimental to bats. And just in case you're interested, these are some garden plants that feed insects that bats eat. And another Wild Ones group told me about a book about moths and the plants that moths eat, and then what plants to plant for moths. Are you guys familiar with that book? It's by a couple in Ohio, Gardening for Moths. That's what it is. Yeah. So I think if you garden for moths, you're feeding bats. So do that, and you'll be all good. The primary prey of bats actually is moths, beetles, and flies. But there's a million kinds of beetles, literally. So, but just feed moths, beetles, and flies, and you're feeding the bats. And it's always a good idea to plant an oak tree. I was lucky enough to host Doug Tallamy at U of I last fall for a seminar. I called him out because in his whole book on oaks, he mentioned the word bat once. And so I called him to tell him how important bats were for oak trees. So one of my students, this is the last story I'll tell you, did a really cool exclusion experiment in the forest in Indiana, where we had plots where we kept no one out. So they had posts up, but no netting. Bats and birds were allowed access all the time. And then we had plots where at night we closed them off so that bats couldn't get in. But during the day, we opened them so birds could get in. And what we found is that where bats were excluded, we had 5 to 6 times more defoliation on the leaves in the plots than where bats were allowed access. And the effect was stronger for oaks than for hickories, probably because hickories have a lot of natural defenses against insects. They're pretty toxic leaves, but oaks are more susceptible. And so bats are actually great for oaks. And oaks, as you know, are great for bats because they're producing lots and lots of insects. So win-win, keep the bats, keep the oaks, and we're all good. So we are going to go over to the park. I think that it's 7:03. So if any 2 people have a question that's something you really think the whole room should hear, then I'll answer those now. And then other questions I will answer while we're walking. You're all welcome to come up and I will answer all your questions. So, yes. Sure. So bats' eyesight is actually pretty good. They are able to see in the dark, and a lot of times they will actually navigate without echolocating. So they'll move on silent mode, which is challenging when we're trying to detect them. But they're not as good at, picking out things quite as good as obviously a lot of other mammals and then us, although our night vision is not great. With regards to hearing, bats are most sensitive to those high frequency sounds, but they actually can hear within the range of humans too. And some bats use echolocation calls that are very sensitive to the sounds of the insects. So they will actually listen for glints of sound from things like a moth beating its wings while it's sitting on a leaf, and they can hear that, and they're able to cue in on that. So those bats are gleaners that will go after prey that's sitting. And for example, here in Illinois, we have the northern long-eared bat and the Rafinesque's big-eared bat, both big-eared bats that use higher frequency calls, and they specialize on moths because those are quiet insects, and the bats are especially adapted to hear those. Yes? So it depends if you have one bat or many bats. If you have one bat, the best strategy would be to open a window or door, turn off the lights, try to go into another room and close the door and see if it leaves. That sometimes works, sometimes it doesn't. If you have a lot of bats, then I give this advice all the time. The best thing to do is to figure out where they're coming and going from the house. So you want to watch outside at sunset, just as we will tonight. You would see bats fly out. They typically emerge between 10 and 20 minutes after sunset during the summer. Illinois does have rules for when you can exclude bats. In fall and spring, you can exclude bats, and then you're not allowed to exclude bats during the winter or the summer, unless there's a serious health hazard. But we don't want to trap bats inside structures. If you need to exclude bats, you can pay a pest control operator to do it. If they don't first look to see where the bats are coming in and out of the house, then you should hire a new pest control operator because they don't know what they're doing. Because the very first thing is to figure out, how do we close this off? Because as I showed you, bats are incredibly faithful to their structures. They're going to come back all the time, right? So if they know the opening, they're going to come back into it. So if you have a colony of bats roosting in your house, you need to figure out how they're coming and going. And then the trick is to kind of systematically close off the entrances till there's one or two. And then you make a one-way exit where the bats can leave, but they can't come back in. And for that reason, you're not allowed to exclude bats during the summer because the moms would leave, but the pups would still be inside. And then the mom wouldn't be able to get back in and the pups would die. So, and then during the winter, they just don't let you exclude bats because if you exclude them, they might have nowhere else to go. And then that could be detrimental. So, okay. All right. So what we're going to do is we're going to follow Kathy's lead and go over to the park, and then I'll dole these bat detectors out when we get over there.